Hey, before anything else, can I ask you a quick favor? Your subscription is what keeps this channel alive. If you've ever felt something from this story or any of the others, or if this channel has ever made your day better, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. It helps me way more than you can imagine. Now, let's get into the story. The first time I saw her, she stood in the doorway of the great hall as if she had been carved from the same moonlight that poured through the high arched windows. The court did what it always does when faced with beauty they can't quite explain. They whispered, they stared, and they invented stories to make themselves feel as if they understood her. I didn't believe any of them. Venus, daughter of the Count of Amber Valley, was a name I'd seen written in the guest lists for the spring season, but I'd imagined someone ordinary. Someone my mother would seat beside me to talk about embroidery patterns and charitable luncheons. Not this. Not the girl whose dark eyes caught the light in a way that made my pulse skip, whose skin was pale like the inside of a seashell, whose gown was black silk despite the court's usual pastels, making her look like she had stepped straight out of a painting that had no business moving. My mother, the Queen, was speaking with the Duke of Norwood, so I was free to stand among the lesser bustle of my ladies-in-waiting, pretending interest in their chatter, while I kept my gaze fixed on Venus. She moved through the room with a kind of grace I had never seen, not the trained elegance of the court, but something older, like she had been moving this way long before Silvershire existed. When our eyes met across the room, my throat went tight, and for one ridiculous second, I forgot to breathe. She didn't smile right away. She looked at me as if she were measuring something unseen, and then, slowly, the corner of her mouth curved. Not a polite court smile, but something private, as though she'd just recognized me from a dream I hadn't had yet. I wanted to step toward her, but I didn't. Princesses do not cross a room without reason, and I had none that would survive my mother's gaze. Instead, I watched her approach the Queen, curtsy with perfect precision, and then exchange a few words that I couldn't hear over the strings and the hum of conversation. When she moved away, she didn't return to the crowd. She came toward me. "Your Highness," she said when she reached me, her voice low and rich, with the faintest lilt I couldn't place. "Venus of Amber Valley." "I know," I said, before realizing how that sounded. "Your name was on the guest list. Was it?" She tilted her head slightly, as if amused by my answer. "Then I'm glad the list didn't disappoint." Her gaze lingered on my face, just long enough for my cheeks to warm. "Would you like to walk in the gardens? I hear they're beautiful at night." The suggestion was absurd. We'd just met, and yet something in me leaned toward her like a flower to sunlight. "The Queen," I began, but she interrupted with a smile that felt like a dare. "The Queen is occupied, and I promise to return you before anyone notices." I should have refused. Instead, I found myself nodding, and moments later we were slipping out through the side doors, into the cool night air. The palace gardens under moonlight were another world entirely, silvered hedges, roses sleeping in shadow, fountains whispering secrets to the dark. Venus walked beside me without hurry, her hand brushing mine once, accidentally, or maybe not. "You look at the moon as if you've never seen it before," she said. "I've seen it," I replied. "Just not like this." "Some things," she said, "are better seen at night." When she turned her head, the moonlight caught her eyes again, and for an instant I thought I saw something impossible there, a glint too sharp, too old. But then she smiled, and the thought slipped away. "May I call you Olivia?" "You may," I said, though hardly anyone outside my family did. "Good," she murmured. "I'd like to." We walked until the music from the hall was only a faint echo, and I realized I had already broken more rules in this one evening than I had in my entire life. And yet, as Venus stopped beside a marble bench and looked at me with that unblinking, impossible gaze, I knew I would do it again. "You have a life laid out before you," she said softly. "Do you ever think about what it would be like to choose something else?" My heart beat in my ears. "I think about it now." She smiled, slow and knowing, as if my answer was exactly what she had expected. Then footsteps sounded from the path ahead, my lady-in-waiting, pale with urgency, calling my name. I turned back to Venus, but she was already stepping into shadow, her voice drifting back like smoke. Until next time, princess. When I returned to the hall, breathless, the crowd was just as it had been, except Venus was gone, and no one seemed to have noticed she'd left at all. The next morning, the memory of her lingered like the taste of something rare, something you know you'll crave again before the day is done. I told myself it was nothing, an unusual conversation in the gardens, a stranger with the kind of beauty that draws attention whether you want it or not. But I carried her voice with me through breakfast, through the endless etiquette lesson my governess insisted I still needed at 19, through the dull meeting with my mother and her advisors about a trade agreement I could barely keep my eyes open for. It wasn't until the afternoon that I saw her again. I was in the library, halfway up a ladder searching for a book I didn't particularly care about, when I heard the sound of a page turning, not the sharp, hurried flick of a courtier pretending to read, but a slow, deliberate motion. I peered over the shelf, and there she was, Venus, seated in the far corner, a book in her hands and sunlight spilling over her like some artist had decided to waste all the good light on her alone. "Princess Olivia," she said without looking up, as if she had known I was there the moment I entered. "Do you make a habit of climbing things to spy on your guests? Do you make a habit of appearing where no one expects you?" I countered, climbing down from the ladder with as much dignity as I could manage. She closed the book, marking her place with a ribbon, and met my gaze. "Only when I'm looking for something worth finding." My pulse did that traitorous jump again. "And what is it you're looking for?" "That," she said, rising to her feet, "remains to be seen." She walked toward me, not quickly but with the kind of measured pace that made each step feel deliberate. The air in the library seemed to change, the sun fading behind a cloud, as if the room knew who it was meant to light for. "The court is tedious," she said, almost in a sigh. "Endless talk about alliances and dowries. But you listen differently." "Differently?" I asked. "Like you're not waiting for your turn to speak," she replied. "Like you might actually care about the answer." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. I just stood there while she stepped closer, close enough for me to notice the faint scent of something cool and sweet, like night air after rain. "Walk with me again," she said, though this time it wasn't a question. And somehow, before I realized I'd agreed, we were leaving the library, my ladies-in-waiting trailing at a distance with looks that promised questions later. She led me not to the gardens this time, but to the western wing, where the older parts of the palace sat untouched, corridors lined with faded tapestries, tall windows clouded with age. We stopped before a door I never opened. "Do you know what's in here?" she asked. I shook my head. "No one comes to this wing anymore." "Then they won't follow," she said, and pushed the door open. Inside was a conservatory, abandoned but not ruined. Glass ceiling streaked with dust, marble floor patterned with shadows from the overgrown plants that had found ways to thrive without gardeners. The air was warmer here, richer, carrying the scent of green things and faint earth. "It's beautiful," I murmured. "It's forgotten," she corrected softly, running her fingers over the edge of an old stone fountain. "There's a difference." She turned back to me, her expression unreadable. "Do you ever feel like the life you live is something someone else chose for you?" "Every day," I admitted, before I could stop myself. Something in her eyes shifted then, a flash of understanding, recognition. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that calm, steady gaze. "Then perhaps," she said, "you should start choosing for yourself." Before I could answer, the bell for the evening meal rang faintly in the distance, breaking the spell. She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes this time.
"Go," she said.
"Before they come looking for you again." I hesitated, but left, glancing back once to see her still standing by the fountain, a figure in black silk framed by green shadows. And I knew, without understanding why, that I would return to that room, even if it meant breaking every rule I'd been taught to obey. I lasted 2 days before I went back to the conservatory. 2 days of dinners where my mother spoke in careful, measured tones about my upcoming responsibilities, of formal lessons in diplomacy that tasted like ash, of polite conversations with Lord Marcus, the latest in a long line of suitors I had no interest in marrying. Through all of it, my thoughts kept drifting to Venus, her voice in the half-light, the way she had looked at me as if she already knew the parts of me I kept hidden. When I finally returned, the late afternoon sun was low, staining the dusty glass of the ceiling in gold and rose. I pushed the heavy door open and found her exactly as I had imagined, leaning against the stone fountain, head tilted toward the light as though she were listening to something I couldn't hear. "Princess," she said without looking up, and the way she said it, soft, almost like a secret, made my pulse quicken. "You came back." "You left the invitation," I replied, moving further inside. She opened her eyes, and I saw that strange, almost too bright glint again, just for a heartbeat before it faded into the darkness of her gaze. Perhaps I did. I joined her at the fountain, the air warmer here than in the rest of the palace. A few stubborn flowers had bloomed despite the neglect, their scent faint but sweet. "Why here?" I asked. "Of all the places in the palace, why this?" "Because it's alive," she said simply. "Everything else here is frozen, perfect, polished, dead. But this place, it remembers how to grow." I didn't know whether she meant the plants or something else entirely. "Do you always speak in riddles?" "Only when I think the truth would be too much all at once." She smiled, but there was something in it that made me shiver, not from fear, but from the sense that she carried entire worlds inside her. "And what truth is that?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "That I've been watching you longer than you think," she said. My breath caught, but before I could answer, she stepped past me, trailing her fingers along the marble as she moved toward a small alcove at the far end of the room. "Come." The alcove was half hidden behind an overgrown arch of ivy, and inside was a bench worn smooth with age. She sat, and I found myself doing the same without thinking. "You're not like the others," she said. "You listen. You see things. But you don't act on them. And you think I should? I think you want to." Her gaze held mine, unblinking, until I felt as though she were reading something beneath my skin. I looked away first, my eyes falling on her hand resting on the bench beside me, pale, elegant, motionless. "What is it you're not telling me?" I asked. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked away. Some things are better discovered than told. There was something final in her tone, but before I could push, the distant echo of footsteps reached us. She rose smoothly, her expression returning to its calm mask. "Go," she murmured. "They'll start asking questions if you're gone too long." "When will I see you again?" She smiled faintly, stepping back into the shadows.
"Soon."
"I'll find you." I left the conservatory, my heart pounding for reasons I didn't fully understand. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the canopy above me, I realized that soon was no longer enough. I didn't just want to see Venus again. I needed to know who she really was and why being near her felt like standing at the edge of something vast and dangerous and impossible to resist. The storm came without warning. By mid-afternoon, the skies over Silvershire had turned the color of steel, and by evening rain hammered the palace windows so hard it sounded like the walls themselves were under siege. Most of the court retired early, content to let the weather swallow the night, but I couldn't sit still. Something restless had taken hold of me since leaving the conservatory 2 days ago, a constant pull toward the West Wing. My ladies-in-waiting thought I was in my rooms reading. In truth, I slipped through the service passages with my skirts gathered in one hand and a lantern in the other, the flames shivering with each gust that wormed through the cracks. When I reached the conservatory door, I half expected it to be locked. It wasn't. Inside, the air was warm and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and rain filtering through the cracked glass above. And she was there. Of course she was, standing by the fountain, her black dress a shadow against the overgrown green. "You're persistent," Venus said without turning. "So are you," I replied, stepping inside. "I thought the storm might keep you away." She glanced over her shoulder, a glint of something in her eyes that the lantern light couldn't quite catch. "I like the rain. It reminds me I'm still here." The words puzzled me, but before I could ask, She gestured toward the far corner where the ivy was thickest. "There's something I want to show you." I followed her to a section of wall I'd never noticed before, where the ivy grew in wild, tangled knots. She pushed it aside to reveal a narrow iron door, its hinges rusted but still strong. "An old servant's exit," she explained, "long since forgotten by most of the palace." She pulled the door open, and a rush of cool, rain-scented air swept in. "Come with me." I hesitated only a moment before stepping out into the downpour. The path was overgrown, the stones slick beneath our feet, but she moved with impossible surety, as though she had walked it 100 times. The rain plastered her hair to her face, and still she looked otherworldly, more beautiful, if that was possible. We emerged into a walled garden I had never seen, its hedges wild, its trees heavy with rain. At the center stood a sundial so weathered the markings were barely visible. "No one comes here," Venus said, resting her hand on the stone. "It's a place outside of time." "Is that why you brought me?" "I brought you because I wanted to see what you looked like when no one else was watching." My breath caught, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears. Love what you've seen so far and want to help me keep creating these awesome stories on this channel? Then subscribe and hit the bell. Your subscription supports the channel and makes sure you get more exciting stories. She stepped closer, rain dripping from her lashes, and for an instant I thought she might kiss me. Instead, she reached up and brushed a wet curl from my cheek, her fingers cool against my skin. "You're warmer than I expected," she murmured, almost to herself. "What do you mean?" I asked, but she only smiled faintly, withdrawing her hand. "Another riddle?" She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head toward the sky, as if listening to something far away. "We should go. The rain will hide our absence, but not for long." Reluctantly, we retraced our steps to the conservatory. Before I could step inside, she caught my wrist, her grip gentle but unyielding. "Olivia," she said, my name sounding strange and beautiful in her voice. "Some truths are dangerous. But I promise you this, when it's time, I'll tell you mine." And then she let go, slipping into the shadows as easily as the rain sliding down the glass, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding and the storm raging just as fiercely inside me as out. The storm passed in the night, but it left the world washed clean and glistening, the air still holding the cool bite of rain. I woke earlier than usual, my mind still tangled in the memory of Venus's hand on my cheek and her words, "Some truths are dangerous," echoing in the quiet of my chambers. My ladies-in-waiting bustled about, choosing gowns and discussing the day's schedule, but their voices felt distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. At breakfast, I sat beside my mother in the great dining hall, nodding at the proper moments as she spoke to her advisors about the upcoming midsummer festival. Yet every polished silver platter, every gilded archway felt like a cage this morning. Across the table, Lord Marcus attempted another tedious conversation about hawking, his blue eyes too proud of themselves for my patience. I gave him polite smiles and murmured responses, all the while imagining the secret garden behind the conservatory wall, the way the rain had made everything glisten like a dream. I could still feel Venus's fingers, cool and deliberate, brushing away that curl of hair. When the meal finally ended, I excused myself under the pretense of reviewing festival speeches in the library. Instead, I waited until the corridors thinned, then took the servants' passage that cut west, my feet carrying me with a certainty I didn't bother to question. The conservatory's air was different today, drier, but still rich with a scent of earth and growing things. She was there, as if she had been waiting, her black gown replaced by something softer, though no less striking, a deep green that seemed to drink in the light. "You always arrive when I'm thinking of you," she said without preamble, her eyes catching mine and holding them as easily as one might hold a silk ribbon. "Or perhaps you're always thinking of me," I replied before I could stop myself. Her lips curved into that slow, knowing smile. "Perhaps." She crossed the floor to meet me, her movements fluid in a way that didn't seem bound by the stiffness of the court. "I want to show you something else," she said, and before I could ask, she led me to the far wall, where another hidden door waited. This one opened into a narrow spiral staircase, the stone worn smooth by centuries of feet. We climbed in near darkness, the only light coming from a small glass slit every few turns. When we emerged, I found myself in a round tower room, its windows high and narrow, overlooking the palace gardens on one side and the distant hills of Amber Valley on the other. "No one comes here anymore," she said, stepping to the largest window. It was once an astronomer's chamber, before the kingdom decided stars had no use in politics. Dust lay thick on the tables, but the great brass telescope still stood in the center, angled toward the pale morning sky. Venus trailed her fingers along its surface, then turned to me. "Do you know why I love this place?" I shook my head. "Because from here, you can see the world without being seen. And when you look out long enough, you start to remember there's more beyond the walls we're given." I stepped to the window beside her, following her gaze to the silver thread of river winding through the fields. "What is Amber Valley like?" I asked. Her smile faltered just enough for me to notice. "It's not what it used to be." She paused, then added, "Some places are beautiful until you learn their history. Then they're only haunted." The word hung between us, strange and heavy, and I wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her expression warned me not to press. Instead, I let the silence stretch, filled only by the sound of the wind against the stone. "Olivia," she said finally, her tone shifting lower now. "Do you trust me?" The question startled me, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I did. "Yes." Her gaze searched mine for a long moment, as if testing the weight of that word. Then she reached into the folds of her gown and withdrew a small object, a ring of silver, its surface engraved with a pattern that seemed to twist and shift in the light. "Keep this," she said, placing it in my palm. Her fingers closed over mine, and I felt that same impossible coolness in her touch. "Why?" I asked. "Because one day soon you'll need it. And when that day comes, you'll know why." I curled my fingers around the ring, feeling its faint, unnatural warmth despite her cold touch. Before I could ask more, the sound of footsteps drifted up the staircase, faint, but growing closer. Venus's eyes narrowed. "It's too soon for them to be curious," she murmured, then took my hand and pulled me toward a second, even narrower stair on the opposite side of the chamber. We descended quickly, emerging into a passage I had never seen, which led us back into the safer, busier halls of the palace. She let go of my hand just before we reached the threshold where people might see, her voice barely above a whisper. "Guard the ring, princess. And remember, you said you'd trust me." And then she was gone, vanishing into the crowd with the same impossible grace, leaving me with a silver ring burning against my palm and the sudden, terrifying certainty that my life had already begun to change in ways I couldn't yet name. That night the palace glittered with the forced gaiety of a diplomatic feast, all crystal chandeliers and carefully arranged smiles. I wore a gown of pale blue satin chosen by my mother's chief dresser, but my thoughts were far from the feast hall. Every time I felt the weight of the silver ring hidden in the folds of my sleeve, my heart tightened. I hadn't taken it off since Venus had placed it in my hand, though I still didn't understand what it meant, or why she had given it to me with such urgency. The hall was a blur of color and movement. Visiting lords and ladies, foreign envoys, my mother at the head of the table, and beside her, Lord Marcus, positioned like a prize she seemed determined to secure for me. He tried to catch my eye as the first course was served, but I deliberately let my gaze drift elsewhere, toward the far end of the room, where Venus sat at the edge of the noble guests, dressed in deep crimson that made her seem like a flame in a sea of pale silks. She didn't look at me at first, her attention apparently fixed on some meaningless conversation with the Earl of Westmere, but I could feel her awareness like a thread pulled taut between us. When she finally turned her head, our eyes met for only a heartbeat, but it was enough. The air seemed to shift, thickening, the sounds of the feast fading into a hum. I almost didn't notice my mother calling my name until her tone sharpened. "Olivia, Lord Marcus was just asking if you might walk with him in the garden after supper." I forced a polite smile. Perhaps another evening, my lord. I'm afraid I've promised myself to the company of a book tonight. A ripple of laughter moved down the table at my deflection, but Marcus's expression tightened. My mother gave me a look that promised a lecture later. The rest of the feast dragged on, each course another barrier between me and the moment I could slip away. When at last the queen rose, signaling the end, I made my bow, murmured the appropriate farewells, and slipped into the side corridors before anyone could stop me. Venus was waiting in the shadow of an archway 2 halls away, her crimson gown catching the torchlight in slow pulses as she stepped forward. "You came," she said. "You asked," I replied. She offered me her arm with the easy confidence of someone who knew I would take it, and I did, the warmth of the gesture startling after the coolness of her skin that first night in the rain. "Where are we going?" I asked as she led me through a narrow, little-used passage that sloped downward. "Somewhere you can hear the truth without being overheard." We descended into the undercellars, the stone walls damp, the air smelling faintly of moss. The passage opened into a chamber lit only by a single lantern hanging from a beam, its glow pooling over a table strewn with old maps and strange, heavy-bound books. "This is where I come when the court is too loud," she said, "and where I keep the things I'm not ready to show the rest of the world." She motioned to the books. "You asked me once what I wasn't telling you. Tonight I'll give you a piece of the answer." She opened one of the books, revealing pages filled with drawings, some landscapes I didn't recognize, some creatures that looked like they'd stepped out of a nightmare, all rendered in exquisite, precise detail. One image stopped me cold, a woman, pale and ageless, eyes dark and glinting, a faint smile playing on her lips. She looked like Venus, but dressed in clothes centuries old. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice low. "Someone I used to be," she said simply. My pulse quickened, my mind stumbling over the words. "Used to be?" "I was 18 the night I stopped being mortal," she said, her gaze holding mine with unblinking steadiness. "That was 57 years ago." I stared at her, my breath caught somewhere between disbelief and the strange, unexplainable certainty that she was telling the truth. "You're saying that I'm not what you think I am," she interrupted gently, "and that the part of me you've been drawn to is the part that hasn't changed in decades." I should have stepped back. I should have felt fear. Instead, I felt the same pull I had from the moment she'd first looked at me in the great hall, stronger now, sharper. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Her expression softened, though her eyes stayed dark, unreadable. "Because you said you trusted me. And because I want you to understand what you're choosing before you decide to stand any closer to me than you already have." The ring in my sleeve seemed to burn against my skin. I didn't give her an answer, not yet. But I also didn't step away. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Venus in the crimson gown at the feast, Venus in the lantern-lit chamber with the maps and ancient books, Venus saying I was choosing to stand close to something that had not been mortal for 57 years. The knowledge should have frightened me, and in a way it did, but it was the kind of fear you feel standing at the edge of a cliff you want to leap from. By morning, the court was buzzing with unrelated gossip. Lord Marcus had apparently made a drunken fool of himself after the feast, and my mother was not pleased, but it all felt far away, as if I were listening from behind glass. I kept turning the silver ring over in my palm under the table, feeling its faint, steady warmth. After the midday audience, when my ladies were occupied with sewing and the queen was closeted with her advisors, I slipped away to the west wing. The conservatory was empty, but a folded scrap of parchment waited on the bench where Venus often sat. "Twilight. Old garden." That was all it said. I hid it in my sleeve and spent the next hours pretending to be where I was meant to be, my thoughts fixed on the moment the sun would touch the horizon. When at last the light turned gold, I took the hidden iron door behind the ivy, just as we had the night of the storm. The old garden was wilder than before, weeds tangling the paths, late summer roses heavy with bloom and scent. Venus stood by the sundial, her hair unbound, dark against the pale marble. She looked softer, though the intensity in her gaze hadn't dimmed. "You came," she said, her voice quieter than usual. You asked, I replied, the same words we'd traded before, but this time they felt like more than an exchange. They felt like a promise. I told you the truth, she said, but there's more you should know. I can disappear from this court tomorrow, if I wish. I've done it before, slipped away, started again somewhere else. But I haven't. And that's because of you. My heart thudded painfully, because in her voice was something dangerously close to longing. Venus, no, she interrupted, stepping closer. Let me say it. You've been taught your whole life to live for duty, for the crown, for your mother's will. I've spent decades avoiding anything that could tie me to a place or a person. And yet here we are. The last of the sunlight slipped below the wall, draping the garden in silver. Her face changed subtly in the moonlight, the shadows carving her features into something sharper, almost inhuman, and yet still beautiful. If you stay near me, she said, it will not be easy. The court will sense something, and they will tear you apart for it. And if they ever learn exactly what I am, she didn't finish. She didn't have to. You gave me the ring for a reason, I said. What is it? She reached for my hand, sliding the ring onto my finger herself. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for me.
It's a ward, she said.
A promise of protection. If I cannot be at your side, it will still keep you safe from others like me. My mind caught on the word others, but before I could ask, she stepped back, her expression unreadable. Wear it always. No matter what happens in the days to come. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the moment. 2 guards, speaking low, making their way down the overgrown path. Venus's eyes flicked toward the gate, then back to me. Go, she murmured. They must not see us here together. I hesitated, but she shook her head, more sharply this time. Go, Olivia. I obeyed, slipping through the ivy-covered door just before the guards rounded the corner. By the time I dared to glance back, the garden was empty, the sundial bathed in moonlight, and Venus was nowhere to be seen. The following day began with the weight of ceremony pressing over the palace, like a second sky. Foreign dignitaries had arrived before dawn, bringing gifts and their own agendas, and the queen had ordered a full day of receptions. I moved through it like a ghost, my hands performing the trained gestures of greeting and politeness, while my mind stayed fixed on the ring now circling my finger. The silver was cool this morning, though once or twice I thought I felt a faint pulse beneath the metal, as if it were breathing against my skin. By the afternoon reception, I was exhausted, not from the duties themselves, but from the constant awareness of eyes on me. Marcus's lingering gaze from across the room, the speculative looks from visiting lords, the calculating glances from the queen's most trusted ladies. And somewhere beyond them, I felt her. I didn't see Venus until the final hour, when the queen allowed the gathering to spill into the gardens. She was standing under a white-blooming arbor, speaking to the Duchess of Marrow, her gown the same deep green as the forest beyond the palace walls. She looked at me once, and that was all it took. The crowd blurred. My mother called my name. I pretended not to hear. I crossed the lawn to her, every step a small defiance. You shouldn't be here, I murmured, stopping just close enough that no one else could hear. I'm exactly where I should be, she replied, her tone calm but her eyes alive with something far more dangerous. Follow me. She turned, her skirts brushing mine as she led me away from the main garden, down a side path shaded by overhanging willows. I didn't ask where we were going. We reached a gate half hidden in ivy and slipped through into a narrow passage between 2 walls. At the end was a wooden door, weathered but intact. She pushed it open, and we stepped into a small enclosed courtyard, long abandoned. The air was cool here, heavy with the scent of damp stone and wild jasmine. No one comes here, she said. It's not on any of the palace maps. We can speak freely. She took a step closer, and my breath caught. The last time we'd been alone, she placed the ring on my finger. Now her gaze flicked down to it, as though to be sure it was still there. Has it warmed yet? She asked. It did. Once. I admitted. When? Last night. She studied me for a long moment, then exhaled. It means someone was watching you. Someone not human. The words slid over my skin like cold water. You mean like you? Yes, she said simply. You've been safe, but I can't be certain for how long. The court is restless. And my kind, most of them have no patience for human politics. They see kingdoms as nothing more than hunting grounds. I swallowed hard. Why tell me this now? Because, she said, her voice low, you deserve to know what you're walking toward if you keep coming to me. I met her gaze, searching for some hint of hesitation. There was none. And if I choose to keep walking? A faint smile touched her lips. Then you will have to trust me to catch you. The air between us seemed to tighten, pulling us together until I could feel the faint coolness radiating from her skin. Her hand came up to my face, fingertips grazing my cheek, and I didn't move away. You don't even know what you're doing to me, she murmured, her voice just above a whisper. Then show me, I said, surprising myself with the boldness of it. For a moment, she didn't move, just looked at me as though weighing every consequence. And then her mouth was on mine. The first kiss was slow, deliberate, her lips cool but soft, tasting faintly of something sweet and metallic. My heart slammed against my ribs, my hands finding her waist without thought. She deepened the kiss, and the world beyond the courtyard dissolved. When she finally pulled back, her gaze was darker, sharper, the faintest hint of something inhuman flickering in her eyes before it faded. Now you know, she said softly. The sound of distant voices broke the moment. She stepped back, her composure sliding into place like a mask.
Go.
Will be seen. I obeyed, slipping through the ivy-covered gate alone, the taste of her still on my lips and the certainty settling into my bones that I would risk far more than my reputation to feel it again. The days after that kiss moved both too quickly and unbearably slow, each hour dragged out by the weight of not seeing her, each night shortened by the restless replay of that moment in the hidden courtyard. I wore the silver ring always, its cool pressure against my skin like a constant reminder that she was real, that what had happened between us wasn't just a fevered imagining. Yet something in the palace had shifted since that day. I could feel it in the corridors, an unease threaded through the marble and gilt, in the way conversation stopped when I entered a room, in the way certain courtiers began to watch me with thinly veiled suspicion. And then there was Marcus. I had been avoiding him for weeks, but now he seemed to appear wherever I was, always with the same practiced charm and faintly smug smile. On the third day after the kiss, he intercepted me outside the library, bowing low before straightening to block my path. Your Highness, he said smoothly. A word in private? I wanted to refuse, but the corridor was too busy with servants and advisors. Any outright dismissal would draw attention I couldn't afford. Reluctantly, I allowed him to lead me into one of the smaller council rooms. The moment the door closed, his expression shifted, the courtly mask slipping just enough to reveal the steel beneath. You've been seen, he said. Not with me. Not with anyone you're supposed to be with. My blood went cold. I don't know what you mean. Don't insult me, he replied, leaning closer. You've been spending time in places you shouldn't, with someone who doesn't belong here. His smile returned, slow and unpleasant. Do you know what they'll do if they find out exactly what she is? My breath caught, but I kept my face still. And what do you think she is? Not what she appears, he said, clearly savoring the words. And dangerous.
To you, to the crown.
But lucky for you, I can keep that knowledge to myself. I hated the way he looked at me, like a cat toying with something already caught. What do you want? His eyes flicked to my hand, to the silver ring. That ring. And your cooperation in making this court believe your attentions are elsewhere. With me, preferably. The thought made my stomach twist. And if I refuse? His smile widened, wolfish now.
Then I speak.
And when I do, I won't have to prove anything. The court will tear her apart simply for the whisper of it. He stepped back, straightening his coat.
Think on it, princess.
My patience has limits. He left me there, the air feeling colder than it had a moment before. I went straight to the West Wing, my mind racing. Venus was waiting in the conservatory, as if she'd known I would come. The moment she saw my face, her eyes darkened. What happened? I told her everything. Marcus's threat, his demand for the ring, his insinuations. She listened without interrupting, but when I finished, she crossed the room in 2 swift strides, taking my hand in hers. You cannot give him this, she said, touching the ring. It's more than a ward, it's a bond. If it leaves you, I won't be able to reach you in time if, she broke off, as if catching herself before saying too much. If what? I pressed. If others come for you, she said finally. You don't understand, Olivia. If Marcus suspects the truth, even a little, he's already put you in more danger than I can protect you from within these walls. Her gaze was fierce, unblinking. We have to move quickly now. Move where? I asked, my pulse pounding. Somewhere they can't follow. Somewhere I can keep you alive. There was no hesitation in her voice, no room for doubt, and in that moment I realized what she was really telling me. The choice I'd been avoiding was no longer something I could delay. In the moonlit glass of the conservatory windows, I could see my own reflection beside hers, mortal and immortal, bound together by a thread that was about to be tested. The plan was simple only in theory. Slip away during the final banquet of the visiting envoys, use the chaos of music and wine to vanish into the western wing, take the hidden door behind the conservatory to the old garden, and from there to the forgotten servants' road that wound down toward the river. Simple, if not for the fact that half the court seemed to be watching me for any misstep, and Marcus was never more than a dozen steps away. The ring felt heavy on my finger, its silver warm now, the faint pulse in it quickening as the night went on. Venus had warned me, if it heated, it meant danger was near. By the 3rd course, I could barely taste the food. My mind was fixed on the moment I would rise from the table and not return. Across the hall, she stood in the shadows beyond the musicians, dressed in black, so deep it seemed to swallow the candlelight. When her eyes found mine, the world narrowed to a single point.
Now.
That was all her gaze said. I excused myself under the pretense of needing fresh air, my heart thudding hard enough I was certain Marcus could hear it. I slipped into the side corridors, past startled servants and locked storerooms, until the familiar green scent of the conservatory wrapped around me. Venus was already there, her hand outstretched. We don't have long, she said, her voice low. Marcus will follow. Then let's make sure he can't, I replied, taking her hand. She led me through the ivy-covered door into the moonlit garden. The night was cool, the air thick with the scent of late-blooming jasmine. Beyond the wall, the servants' road stretched in silver shadow, the river glinting in the distance. We had barely taken 3 steps before a voice rang out behind us. Going somewhere, princess? Marcus stepped into the garden, flanked by 2 of his men. He was smiling, but there was no warmth in it. You didn't answer my offer, so I'll take your silence as refusal. A pity. I might have protected you from her. His gaze slid to Venus, full of smug satisfaction. Do you know what she is, Olivia? Shall I tell the whole court? They wouldn't believe you, I said, though my voice was unsteady. Oh, they would, he replied. Especially when you vanished together into the night. Venus stepped in front of me, her voice like ice. Leave now, Marcus, and you live to see the dawn. He laughed, but it was cut short when she moved, faster than my eyes could follow, a blur of shadow and silk. In an instant she had him by the throat, lifting him just enough that his boots scraped the gravel. You don't know what you're inviting, playing games with me, she hissed, her voice edged with something not human. His men lunged forward, but the ring on my finger flared hot, and they staggered back as if struck by an unseen force. Venus dropped Marcus to the ground, where he scrambled away, coughing, his eyes wide with terror. Tell them, she said softly. See if they believe a coward's word. He fled without looking back. The garden was silent except for my quick, uneven breathing. You didn't have to. I began, but she turned to me, her eyes still dark and strange from whatever part of herself she'd unleashed. Yes, I did. You're not safe here anymore. You have to choose. Choose. Stay in this palace, marry the man your mother selects, and forget me, or come with me now. Leave behind everything you've been told you must be. Walk into a life you'll never be able to return from. Her words fell like stones into the stillness, sending ripples through everything I thought I knew. I looked at her, really looked at her. The impossible beauty, the centuries-old sadness, the fierce way she'd stepped between me and danger without hesitation. And I knew. I'm not afraid, I said, my voice steady now. Not of you. Not of what comes after. Something broke in her then. Not her composure, but the distance she'd kept wrapped around herself like armor. She closed the space between us in 2 steps, her hands framing my face, and kissed me. This kiss was nothing like the first. This was deep, claiming, a seal on a choice made with eyes open. I felt the cool press of her lips, the faint sweetness of her breath, and the dizzying sense that the world was tilting towards something vast and unknown. When she pulled back, her forehead rested against mine. Then we go, she whispered. Hand in hand, we left the garden, our footsteps sure on the road that curved toward the river and beyond. The palace lights faded behind us, swallowed by the night. Whatever waited ahead, danger, eternity, love, it was ours now. And I would walk into it willingly, as long as she walked beside me.